Good afternoon. I am Steve Grundman. I'm a senior fellow here at the Atlanta Council, and I'm very pleased to be here to host this event on game changers, implications of the Russo-Ukraine war for the future of ground warfare. Thank you everyone for coming who's here in the room, and thank you those of you who are watching on the live stream. This event is the culmination of a project, shorthand Ukraine Game Changers, that we got started last summer. The main deliverable of which is a report with the aforementioned title by Dr. T.X. Hammes, who is here today, and after some introductory remarks, we will bring him and others to the stage to have a full discussion, both of his own findings in this paper and those observations of others whom we've gathered around this topic to talk with us this afternoon. My role here is mostly behind me in respect to the fact that I've supervised getting us to this point, but I'm also maybe therefore the logical one to host this event and serve as its MC, if you will. Furthermore, I'm going to give you some context for the project. I will orient you to the event itself, exactly how we're going to run the show. Then I'll make introductions, most especially to the gentleman giving our keynote remarks. This is a project that's been undertaken within the business unit, let's call it, of the Atlanta Council, called the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. And one important piece of context is for you, both in the room again and those of you watching, to have a sense for what the Scowcroft Center is about. The Scowcroft Center works to develop sustainable, nonpartisan strategies to address the most important security challenges facing the United States and the world. The center honors General Brent Scowcroft's legacy of service and embodies his ethos of nonpartisan commitment to the cause of security, support for U.S. leadership and cooperation with allies and partners, and dedication to the mentorship of the next generation of leaders. We here at the Council are very proud of our affiliation and affinity with General Scowcroft, and would never miss an opportunity to invoke that, as I have just done. Indeed, I think, as we'll see, this project and the work that results from it and the conversation you're going to hear about the topic is exemplary of what I think General Scowcroft wanted for us here at the Atlanta Council and would want for a healthy debate about strategy and security of the United States and its allies and partners. Here's the run of show. I'm going to introduce General Mark Klingon, who I'll introduce presently, and he's going to give some keynote remarks, table setter, from someone who's actively serving and charged with the duty of himself and at the Marine Corps Combat Development Command, figuring out for themselves what we may or should be learning from the combat in Ukraine. So General Klingon will make some keynote remarks at the beginning. I will then back up briefly to introduce the report's author, Dr. T.X. Hammes, who will give us a short summary of the paper. It's only been published today, so you're not behind if you haven't read the paper yet. It only just came out, and so to facilitate our conversation about it, we'll have a whole, not a whole, but a 10-minute summary of it that TX will deliver right from this podium. We'll need a minute, not even a full minute, when he's done for the staff to remove this podium so that you'll have full view of the panel, which will then assemble a panel that will be moderated by Jen Judson of Defense News, and she'll introduce herself and the panelists when that time comes. Toward the end of these 90 minutes, and we will end sharply at 5 o'clock Eastern, maybe in the last 10 minutes, let's see what kinds of hands go up and questions come over Twitter. We'll take questions from those of you who are here and those of you who are watching online. Jen will moderate those questions and direct them to the panelists as well. We welcome that very much. It's an important part of the event. An event which, needless to say, is open, public, and on the record. So if you do give us a question or step up to the mic to offer a question, please identify yourself and your affiliation so that we can keep faith with that principle. Okay, I will then turn to that first or next part of the agenda, and that is to introduce General Mark Klingon, Brigadier General Mark Klingon. As I said, he is currently serving as the Assistant Deputy Commandant to Combat Development and Integration and the Deputy Commanding General of the Marine Corps Combat Development Command. He joined the Marine Corps as an enlistedman in the Marine Corps Reserve back in 1989 and was commissioned from the Naval Reserve Officer Training Corps out of American University, where he got a bachelor's degree in 1993. He has done everything you would hope and expect an accomplished Marine Corps officer has done. He's been a rifle platoon commander, a weapons and rifle commander, an operations and executive officer at battalion level, an operations and executive officer at brigade level, and also he was the Future Operations Officer, Marine Forces, Europe and Africa, Assistant Division Commander of 3rd Marine Division, and Chief of Staff, 3 Marine Expeditionary Force. I'm gonna leave it at that. He wouldn't want me to go on and on, but not least because I'm also anxious to hear his table-setting keynote remarks. General Klingen, thanks very much for coming.
Hey, good afternoon. So, as the introduction said, I'm the Assistant Deputy Commandant at Combat Development Integration, and basically we do requirements for the Marine Corps. And prior to coming here to Quantico, I was out in the Pacific, and so everything I do, I always have a keen eye in terms of how what we're doing here with force design relates to what we're doing in the Pacific. But before I get to all that, I just want to say it's really an honor to be here. It really is, so thank you for the opportunity. I am a fan of many of the speakers who are going to be up here behind me afterwards, and I really look forward to hearing what they have to say. Let me go back in time. So a little over a year ago, as it became apparent that Russia was going to invade Ukraine, the Commandant of the Marine Corps pulled in all his primary staff officers to include my boss and said, hey, I want to do a pre-mortem. I want to be able to take a look at what's unfolding and be able to see the ramifications and implications of what this means for the future fight. And so I think everyone knows that the Marine Corps is undergoing a huge modernization program called force design. And so very much we are very keenly looking at what is going on in the Ukraine and the implications of what that means for our force design. And I would say that all the world has been looking very keenly at what's been going on in Ukraine, and to see, is this just a regional proxy war, or does it have some lessons applicable to the Pacific, the pacing threat, which is China, or even in Taiwan? So first, I think it's important to ensure and to lay out that we're not learning the wrong lessons. So a few months ago, I went to an armor conference in London, and at the beginning of the conference, they were all the armor officers were lamenting that about a year ago they thought it was the death of armor, but now that the Ukraine was about to receive tanks from the United States and Germany and many of their allies, that the tank was here to stay. And I'm not here to say that tanks aren't valuable or we don't need tanks in the military, but I do offer a few criticisms which may provide justification for the Marine Corps' recent decisions to divest of tanks. So I think, as we've seen with the Russian advance, logistics matters. And just as the National Defense Strategy states that China is the pacing threat, our Commandant has stated that logistics is the pacing warfighting function within what we do in the military. So maneuver used to be the first among equals of warfighting functions, but now logistics and maneuver have become intertwined. And I guess to put it really bluntly, unless you have an inside force that's already there and ready to transition to being a stand-in force, you're going to have to fight to get to the fight. And A2AD, or anti-area access denial, is not just a phenomenon that we're concerned about in the Pacific. The modern battlefield is all within inside the WEZ, or the Weapons Engagement Zone. And all of Europe is inside a weapons engagement zone. It's just that right now it's not being employed due to the limitations of the war going on in Ukraine. In this conflict, we have seen uncontested logistics across the Atlantic and the relative sanctuary of NATO countries up to the border of Ukraine. And so I state that we may be learning the wrong lessons, or at least focusing on some of the wrong lessons, because with cyber, contested logistics begins not just when you get within theater, but arguably within the industrial base, especially with second-tier contractors as they're assembling very complex hardware. So the Marine Corps has been criticized with getting rid of its armor and heavy formations, but arguably heavy formations may never get to the fight, or at least have a very difficult time getting to the fight, and once they get there, have a hard time being sustained. So the next thing I'd like to offer is that the industrial base matters. Clearly, the conflict in Ukraine has identified some key weaknesses in our capability and capacity. President Eisenhower's parting address in 1961 warned of the military-industrial complex. We are so far removed from that reality today. Procurement processes in the industrial base have been optimized for the 1990s and the post-Cold War era. Our production may not be sufficient for the future conflict, particularly with the American way of war. And so, for example, one Chinese shipyard can produce more ships in a year than all of ours combined. This conflict has seen high expenditure of both smart and dumb bombs on both sides. So to give you an example, in Ukraine, they're producing hundreds of armed drones a day, hundreds. So also within the theater, tactical depots, supply chains, they will all be targeted. So my first deployment was 1990 to Desert Storm as a young lance corporal. And so the mass iron mountains that we are used to having, and we replicated that in OIF, Operation Enduring Freedom, and even to a certain degree in Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan. Those large depots, those connectors, those airfields, they are going to be targeted. So we're going to need to have ambiguity and redundancy. So some have offered that foraging is an option, going back to the Civil War, Napoleonic age, but you can't forge ammunition, you can't forge Class 9 parts to your machinery, so you're going to have a robust supply system and a supply chain that can be relevant. So units may need to be able to repair items with 3D printing that are co-located with the unit, but these are still operational and not fully realized. Also, with increased sensors to include even cell phones, precision fires, luring munitions, I won't say that the defense has the advantage, particularly because it can be targeted, and as the defense emits with its electromagnetic signature, it can be targeted. But what I will say is that the offense, and specifically offensive maneuver, is now very difficult, and particularly as units can now mass fires without having to mask their formations. This example I give may be an oversimplification, but I think it's a useful one. So in eastern Ukraine right now, it looks akin to World War I trench lines of 1915, 1916. Both sides are in their trench lines doing artillery duels, and they're going back to stormtrooper tactics that the Germans employed at the end of World War I, perhaps augmented with UAVs. So history's shown that the Germans, to overcome the trench line warfare, they created blitzkrieg with combined arms to regain maneuver. And I would argue that maneuver in many ways was perhaps perfected in Desert Storm or in OIF-1. However, combined arms in today's day and age is much more complex, particularly with cyber, space, information domain, quadcopters, and loitering munitions. So to break this down, as an infantryman, if I am in a trench line and I want to move my unit from one trench line or one cover and concealed position to the next, I need to set conditions for them to be able to maneuver. I need to suppress the enemy. I need to obscure his vision. I need to achieve some type of destruction criteria before I can go ahead and maneuver. But to do that in today's day and age with these new multi-domain assets, multi-domain combined arms is far more complex than we have anticipated. And so we will need to go ahead and figure out how to set those conditions across the multi-domain spectrum. Until we can man, train, and equip to doing those multi-domain combined arms, we may be accepting risk as we try and reintroduce armor into the battlefield. And so what I would ask is while the Russians had difficulty with their mechanized infantry and with their artillery and their logistics, I have yet to see any convincing evidence that will state that Western tanks will fare any better against the Russians than the Russians' tanks compared against the Ukrainians. Next, air defense is key against missiles, rockets, and drones. So after World War I, Douay stated the bomber will always get through. And we know that's not necessarily true, especially if air defense is resourced, and you can see that with Iron Dome in Israel and other examples like that. But force protection will be key to protect ports, airfields, depots, and the civilian population. Also, due to cyber, space, long-range munitions, civilians will need to be prepared for war. So past history, since after World War II, the United States has been used to experiencing warfare from the virtual sanctuary of the continental United States, and the only experience that Americans had, if they were back here, was watching it on news, Fox, CNN, and the like. That reality may change significantly. Interestingly enough, in 2018, Sweden put out a pamphlet for all of its population, if crisis comes to war. And when the Swedes received this, a lot of them were really concerned and offended, and they actually wanted to send it back to the government. But the reality of us going back to that similar type of total war could be a reality as we go into the future. So I'd also like to ask a question. If Russia knew over a year later that they would be still entangled in this conflict, would they have engaged in the conflict to begin with? So I would argue that being prepared and being a hard target in competition matters. Russia invaded because of perceived weakness, so posture, rehearsals, and exercises matter. Working with allies and partners matter, because that makes a form of very viable deterrent. Reserve training and mobilization, that also matters. And rehearsing that mobilization is key. Activation needs to happen not just in hours, not just in days and weeks, but in hours for it to be relevant. Key infrastructure, border crossings, all of that, bridges, ports, runways, choke points, they all need to be secured rapidly. Also, the first volley in any conflict will probably be in space, cyber, or electronic warfare. And in many cases, these volleys are going on right now, in competition. It's just we don't know it or don't realize it. To that end, communications will require hardening and redundancy, particularly in disrupted, disconnected, intermittent, and low bandwidth, or what we call DDIL environments. And signature management will be key, because if you admit on the battle space, you will be targeted, and with precision-guided munitions, your command and control will very quickly be destroyed. I won't say that Intel always gets it wrong, but I will say that Intel never gets it all right. So similar to Pearl Harbor, the 1990 Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, the catastrophic success of Desert Storm, 9/11, and even the Iraqi post-invasion insurgency, Intel doesn't always get it all right. No one expected that the Ukrainians would be able to put up the defense that they have today and still to date. And so I think we need, even with all the sensors we have across the battle space, we need to expect the unexpected. And the unthinkable is not only possible, but in many cases likely. What we've also seen is the best innovation comes from the young warrior in the field, and we've seen all kinds of innovation from the Ukrainians. So, and even our forces, our Army and our Marine Corps have been adopting some of these tactics, techniques, and procedures. So now in our basic infantry training, we are actually using drones to walk on indirect fire from our machine guns and automatic grenade launchers, something which seems very basic and rudimentary, but until a few months ago, we had never done before. So when I was in Europe recently, I was very fortunate to be able to meet a lot of the key leaders in NATO and some of the partnering nations, and they called Ukraine a wake-up call. And so I asked, well, if Ukraine's a wake-up call, what was Crimea in 2014? And interestingly enough, the answer I got was, well, that was a wake-up call too, but Europe hit the snooze button. And so I'd argue that perhaps we learned some of the wrong lessons then, and we have to be really careful to not learn the wrong lessons now. So I'd like to close with two quotes. The first one's attributed to Thucydides. It says, "A nation that draws too broad a difference between its scholars and its warriors will have its thinking done by cowards and its fighting done by fools." And the second one is by Sun Tzu. It says, "Victorious warriors win first and then go to war, while defeated warriors go to war first and then seek to win." So discussions like this help both scholars and warriors understand the nature of the conflict, which is the first step towards winning. And so I can say that I read TX's article. I found it very insightful, very helpful, very on point, and I think it will be a good base for the conversation that we're about to go ahead and listen to today. I look forward to the rest of the speakers. Thank you all for the opportunity to address you all, and Semper Fidelis.
Thank you very much, General Klingon. That perfectly sets the table for what we want to do here in the remainder of the event. Before I introduce TX, a round of gratitudes, of thank yous. This project would not have been possible but for the financial support of three companies, Elbit Systems of America, whose CEO, Renan Horowitz, is here today, Maxar Technologies, who's represented here today by Brian Wenger, its Director of Public Sector Communications, and SAIC, represented here today by my friend John Bonsall. Brian Wagner, forgive me that. And also to TX did the hardest work here, and I'm going to thank him as I already have profusely. But he also got some help. Three of those who helped him, John Whitley, Lee Quintus, and Gary Dunow, will be on the panel. But I also, on behalf of the Atlanta Council, wanted to call all three of you out, so to speak, for some extra gratitude, if only personally from me. Each of you put a strong effort into helping TX make this a better paper, and it shows. It's a terrific paper, which TX is now going to mount the stage to introduce. I will introduce him briefly. He is a distinguished research fellow at the Institute for National Strategic Studies at the U.S. National Defense University, where he studies, among other things, future conflict and the changing character of war. Thus, I thought first to call TX when the opportunity to do this project and have someone write this paper came to hand. He is a graduate of the Naval Academy, but also holds a master's degree in historical research and a doctorate in modern history from Oxford University. He writes a lot. He's got 3 books. The one I'll call out the title of is The Sling and the Stone on War in the 21st Century, and literally dozens, I dare say maybe hundreds, a couple of hundred articles and journal articles, the one of which I'm going to call out, also done under the aegis of the Atlanta Council a couple of years ago, is called Affordable Defense, An Affordable Defense of Asia. Before all that, TX had a 30-year career in the United States Marine Corps. So TX, thanks for your hard work and insightful writing on this topic. Please give us a summary of it.
Well, the General and I are pretty much in violent agreement. What I'm going to talk to, I've only got 10 minutes, so I'm not going to cover a large part of the paper. I'm going to focus on what's changing the character of ground warfare. And so the obvious question is, where do you look for things that are going to change the future of warfare? And if you're a historian, you look back, and let's take World War II. We see Blitzkrieg, which surprises everybody at the beginning of World War II. But as the General mentioned, this is all developed at the end of World War I. But it's a very small part of the force that's doing this. The British have 8 brigades of tanks, or about 8,000 men, in a force of 500,000. A lot of people missed that. They didn't see that coming. Tanks, airplanes, radios, logistics, et cetera, were all changed. But all of those were a small percentage, and the key thing was understanding how to tie them together. And that's where the Germans took the stormtrooping tactics they developed to penetrate trenches and applied it with the new technology. So it's the two have to come together. Now, what's interesting about the conflict in Ukraine today is 90% at least of each force is a 20th century force. The equipment was built in the 20th century, the concepts were developed, the training was developed. All of this is essentially a 20th century force, except for 5 to 10% on each side. And that's where you want to look. What are those 5%, 10% doing? And again, it's not just the tech, it's the ability to use it. Now, that's what's been really interesting about Ukraine is the ability to integrate new systems to create game-changing capabilities. And there are 3 that I'm going to talk about. The first is integrated command and control. The second is how to exploit the pervasive surveillance provided by civilian assets. And the third is how to get precise massed fires. So first integrated C2. The Russians struck first with cyber and took down Viasat, and so that kind of crippled the Ukrainian command and control at the beginning. But they quickly absorbed Starlink and established an entirely new network for command and control, and they tied that to DIA, which was their government, digital government. It's what they developed from the Baltics. They use, everything's done on your cell phone. So every cell phone can talk to the central database. They took those two, mashed them together, and then were agnostic about input. So you could pull down information from anywhere. NATO, EU joined in and figured out a way to tap in our classified material to that, and then improvised. And then Palantir AI became involved when it allowed them to sort through all that information. So now you're seeing what's happening in the battle space, but you can do something about it. Frankly, I'm not sure the U.S. can duplicate it. We're building JADC2, an enormous global system, but the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force have completely different ideas of what this is going to be. It's a much bigger challenge, and it's going to be hard. Other nations in NATO, smaller nations, can probably take DIA, which is developed to Delta, and actually apply it. Russia's developing countermeasures, as always in warfare, to Starlink, but then the Ukrainians develop countermeasures, and we'll continue to see that. The key is what survives, and it comes from experimentation and testing it. The second big area is pervasive surveillance. Now, we've had military satellites up, et cetera, military surveillance, but what's really different is so much coming out of commercial satellites and commercial drones. Commercial satellites, multispectral imagery, by the first week of March, 5 different commercial companies were selling finished products to the Ukrainian defense. And that's because over the years, they've been working through this to develop the U.S. military, but more important, most of these satellites are up there for commercial purposes, for futures traders. I want to know what's changing in the wheat fields in Ukraine. I want to know what the oils are looking like. There's also multiple daily passes of radar, synthetic aperture radar, and electromagnetic spectrum. In multispectral, you can look at the same place on the planet up to 10 times a day. Change detection software. If I'm a futures trader, I don't want to be a squint and try to figure out what the photograph's telling me. I want you to tell me what's different. And so change detection software was developed. Now, this is going to thicken. We've got a lot up there now, but by 2030, the estimate is there will be 100,000 small satellites up. Now, maybe 10,000 will be Earth observation, the rest will be communication satellites, et cetera. The other thing is drones. As the general said, hundreds of drones being produced all the time, from DJI quadcopters to long-range drones like Bayraktar. But what I think is really interesting is the most important has been observation intelligence. Lots of great videos of dropping hand grenades on individual Russian pieces of equipment and people, but the real payoff has been adjusting fires and providing intelligence to the commanders. Now, with advanced manufacturing, we could produce 10,000 drones a day out of a single factory, a simple fixed-wing drone. And the type of drone's already been done by a professor at University of Virginia. We can talk about that in Q&A if you want. A big factory can produce you 100,000, and that's going to be the challenge. That brings us to precise massed fires. Manpack anti-tank got most of the publicity at the beginning, particularly Javelin, all the St. Javelin videos, and the Stugna P videos, which are actually better because you can see the screen better. NLAWs, RPGs. This is an expanding field. Everybody's building all kinds of stuff to kill armored vehicles at a distance beyond the distance you can put an infantry screen out. You simply can't push your infantry out far enough. For instance, Israelis has one that starts killing you at 90 kilometers. You're no longer a screen if you're 90 kilometers ahead of the tank. Artillery, the precision munitions are showing, we haven't got a lot of them. Most of the fire has been massed fire, but when you see what the precision munitions have done, HIMARS and MLRS hit the key command nodes and key logistic nodes. By taking out those rail nodes, they pushed Russian rail logistics back and reduced effectively the ammunition getting to the Russian front line between 50 and 70%. That's a huge difference. We have not yet got, at least haven't seen any evidence unclassified of the ground-linked small diameter bomb, which is a 250-pound glide bomb made into a rocket so it can be fired at a HIMARS, and it'll fly 150 kilometers. But loitering munitions have been the big change. Hundreds and hundreds of loitering munitions. Switchblade, Warmate, Drone 40, these are all small, cheap, deployable. For the price of one M1A2, you could have 9,000 of the Drone 40s. The Drone 40 is a little drone you throw in the air. You literally throw it in the air. It flies out to 15 kilometers hunting things. And then it calls in the attack drones with it. So an infantry company could put 1,000 of those in the air pretty easily and fairly inexpensively by modern weapon standards. So your question is, how do you maneuver, and even tougher, how do you resupply if there's 1,000 active hunters over your battle space? You've really got to think that through. Orange confirmed that 70% of the kills in the Nagorno-Karabakh war were done by drones or loitering munitions, 70% of the vehicle kills. The other thing Ukrainians have introduced is the use of drones for long-range strike against airfields. That's a real concern to me because, for instance, the Israelis fielded the Harap 15 years ago, and it outranges the F-35, so it can go after your airfield before the F-35 can reach it. It also launches from the back of a truck, so you don't know where the hell it is. So what are the implications? Defense is definitely gaining an advantage. Now, as we project this out, these changes take place over a decade or 2 decades, hopefully faster this time. But in a decade or 2, you may not be able to get up and move. It just may be impossible. So you have to structure your forces starting today for ubiquitous surveillance. They're always looking at me. They'll always know if I move. How do I prevent that? How do I go to passive reconnaissance on the defense so that you don't see me until I shoot at you? Those are the things we've got to explore. Autonomy is essential. If I'm going to put 1,000 drones in here, I don't have 1,000 pilots, thank God. But you don't have to listen to 1,000 pilots. You've got to have this autonomy out there taking care of it for you. So autonomy is essential. It is also the only moral choice in major conflict. It is immoral to reject autonomy because you're accepting loss. And it's immoral to go to war if you plan to lose it. Air power is changing. Missiles and drones have been taking over a lot of the missions on offense because the air defense systems have kind of kept the manned aircraft on their own side. Manned aircraft are up and launching long-range weapons, but those essentially are missiles and drones, and why do we need the aircraft to get them up there? So we've got to look through that. And then most advances will come out of the commercial sector. More and more out of advanced manufacturing. We should be investing heavily in advanced manufacturing. It's good we're tripling and quadrupling the production of our 155s, but that's World War II technology we're investing in. We need to look at what's advanced manufacturing, give us precision. So what are my recommendations? The West needs to focus on integrating 3 areas and understand their impact. Pervasive surveillance, advanced command and control, and precision with mass. And that's my 10 minutes. Sure, we get all the same points.
And your experience. And also, as you introduce yourselves, I'd like you to provide an example from Ukraine of the changes on the battlefield or something that is reinforcing existing characteristics of ground war. So you can choose between the two, but we'll start here with Lee and we'll get going.
Okay. My name's Lee Quintus. I retired from the Army early last year after 35 years in uniform. I'm a career armor and cavalry officer, so I may have something to say later about tank battalions leaving the Marine Corps. Some key assignments include, I was a hardware division chief in the Army's G8. I was the armor school commandant and the chief of armor and cavalry. I was the director of concept development and learning at Training and Doctrine Command. And in my final 2 assignments, I was the commander of the 3rd Infantry Division, to include while deployed to Afghanistan. And I finished as the Deputy Commanding General of U.S. Forces Command. Currently, I'm a senior mentor for the United States Army's Mission Command Training Program, their Warfighter program. So I coach, teach, and mentor division and corps commanders, their subordinate commanders and staffs as they conduct exercises. And I also am an advisor to corporate and nonprofit entities. So some initial thoughts. With great respect to TX, I would submit that these game-changing technologies are not, in fact, changing the correct character of warfare. In fact, they represent an evolutionary change in the development of warfare and conflict. What's decisive, as he's indicated, is the innovative approaches to capabilities. And historically, what we have seen is that it doesn't matter if you have more of something or it's a better thing. What counts is your innovative application of capabilities broadly as applied to areas like doctrine, organization, training, and leadership. And I believe that holds true today. Secondly, it's important to acknowledge the theater of war. So we have a David and Goliath type scenario. We have a David, the Ukrainian army, who is relatively newly organized, trained, and equipped, but maybe more importantly, they are very well led, and they have an excellent culture of innovation and initiative. And you contrast that against Goliath, the Russian army, which arguably has been adequately equipped, yet they are very poorly organized, very poorly manned, and they have inept leadership at echelon. And so I think all of our conclusions have to be drawn from within that framework. And then the third initial observation I would have is I would caution against the designation of game-changing technologies. In fact, when I was in the G8, that was outlawed. You couldn't say game-changing. There were no game-changing technologies because today's game changer is often addressed tomorrow by an offset in technology or some asymmetric capability. So I'll conclude there.
All right.
Opening
Thank you so much, Lee. We'll go next to John.
Hello. That was great. Thank you. My name is John Whitley. I was the Army CFO, the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Financial Management and Controller for several years. And during that period, I had the honor also of being the acting CAPE, Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation Director. And then during the last transition, the acting Secretary of the Army. So I agree that there are lots of incremental changes, and I think TX does a good job in the paper of laying out some things that are consistent with past wars and some things that are either new trends or accelerations of existing trends. To me, what's most interesting is what are the ones that have the most implications that are either consistent with how we're currently thinking about things or contradicting how we're currently thinking about things. One of the things TX talks about is the importance of preparation. So I would highlight that with the Ukraine context, the 2014 the 2022 training that went on. And I would say that's something that certainly has an implication for the Pacific and what we might think about with respect to Taiwan. TX also points out the importance, and it was said here earlier as well, the importance of industrial base and industrial base capacity and the ability to support a long war. It was a surprise, I think, to many how long this war has progressed. Planners tend to be optimistic. They think about short wars, and I would say that's a lot of the thinking coming out of the Pentagon right now, is that the war in the Pacific would be a very short war. So I think that's a continuity with past wars, the importance of industrial-based depth, and that you have to be prepared for a protracted conflict. And I think that's something to highlight because it's perhaps not as consistent with current thinking. Another one that TX didn't mention in the paper, but I would add to the mix, was the political environment leading up to this. You know, my understanding, not having been in government at the time, but my understanding is the intelligence community was pretty clear that they thought this was different than past buildups, that this was the real deal. And so if that's true, and if we really had reason to believe that this was different, it's noticeable that we really did not engage in any significant forced mobilizations until after the invasion began. We really did not. We were not able to really mobilize our partners and allies in the material ways that we've been able to since until the war actually began, until conflict actually started. And again, I think that's a good one for thinking about the Pacific. A lot of the thinking in the Pentagon is we're going to move very fast. We're going to move, as soon as we see the ships leaving port. Things like that. Is that realistic? And what does the scenarios look like? And how would you engage? How would you conduct these operations if you put really politically realistic timelines for engaging with partners and allies and mobilizing our forces and doing the things that we need to do?
All right, thank you. Dara.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dara Massico with the RAND Corporation. Prior to RAND, I was in the DoD. And when I look out at this war, I follow the Russian military. I see multiple generations here. I see equipment that's perhaps 2 generations. I think now we're breaking into 3 generations old. I'm seeing cruise missiles that were 1 generation ago from ours. And I'm seeing new technologies introduced in new ways, and I'm seeing old technologies used in new ways. I think for me, the biggest game changer that we could talk about, even though we're not supposed to use game changer, so I'm going to use that in a loose sense of the term, is the introduction of surveillance at depth, whether that's space-based commercial, whether that's governmental support being provided to the Ukrainians, or whether it's airborne platforms. The second thing I think that really is the difference between the two is innovation. The Russians are innovating in their way. The Ukrainians, however, I think are innovating in a much more flexible way. And that comes down to the people that you have and how you view your people. Do you have something that you can contribute, and do we need to go for it? We do. And I see that playing out at a systemic level in the Ukrainian armed forces. I don't see it playing out the same way inside the Russian system. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks. My name is Gary Duno. I'm with Maxar International, having just completed a 4-decade career between the Air Force and the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. So, sir, I own the intel comment that you made earlier. I appreciate the work TX put into the paper and the opportunity to contribute, and the council having us here. I think it's a really interesting topic. What I would say has been game-changing throughout this conflict, in my opinion, not to repeat some of the things that I've said, but is the use of data and the role of data as a weapon per se in the conflict, and the way that the Ukrainians in particular have taken an agnostic approach to data and the sources of data, which is different than what we've done traditionally, right? Traditionally, the decisive factor for our decision makers has been our collection, both capacity and the kind of collection we have, and the fact that we were able to collect things that others couldn't. That has changed with the proliferation of sensors in space and aircraft and drones. The general talked about this, others have talked about it. TX has it very thoroughly entwined throughout his paper. The battlefield is transparent nowadays, or becoming more and more transparent. And so the decision advantage comes in how you sift through that data, find the right piece of data, and apply it at the right place at the right time. I think the Ukrainians have done a really good job of that, whether it's coming from classified capabilities, but more importantly, I think the unclassified capabilities, which haven't always been considered on the same level with classified capabilities in previous conflicts and previous actions. And I think some examples of that are from a strategic level, how some nations declassified some information in the buildup to the war, and how news bureaus like ours put commercial imagery out there to transparently show the world what was happening. That's one advantage of commercial imagery. It's inherently shareable with everybody, and it allows you to show the truth. And I think also in documenting war crimes in places like Bucha and Mariupol as well. But also at the tactical level, where the Ukrainians have taken advantage of the average citizen's ability to take a social media post and send it to troops who can then target a vehicle or soldiers. So I'll leave it there.
Well, thank you so much, everybody, for your introductory remarks here. Wanted to ask, as conversations of the war have dragged on, often, we talk about lessons learned or observations. What can we take from this? But I want to flip that and ask, what do you believe are lessons that perhaps we should not draw from this war? So I'll start with Dara on this one, if you'd like to take the first crack.
Sure, this is very much a war in progress. It's not decided yet. There's certain characteristics about this war that we might not be able to rely on in the future. And to go back to your point about releasing intelligence and pre-bunking, we might not have that ability in a future conflict. We might not have a partner who's willing to ingest that material and go out and fight for it in the way the Ukrainians are. So there are some aspects of this war that I think are unique to it that were not even present in the previous war in Ukraine 9 years ago. Well, when it started, I should say, 9 years ago. So we just have to be really careful here about what is unique, what is fleeting, what may change in the future. And that could, one example I like to think about is space-based surveillance. The Russians have not chosen to use their counter-space capabilities right now, and there's a few reasons for that. It could be that it's an escalatory choice. They want to confine things to Ukraine, with the exception of the Ukrainian satellite network that they targeted early on. Or it could be that the proliferation of these capabilities is just too difficult. There's too many. There's too many thousands that are coming online, and so the Russians are probably trying to figure this out in real time as well. So I would just caution that things that may hold true now, this is a unique conflict, and we had a unique opportunity and a unique partner that might not be present next time.
Absolutely. Anyone else want to pile on that before we go to the next question? Yeah,
First, just to lead. I agree, there are no game-changing technologies, but there are game-changing capabilities. And it's how you tie those capabilities through your doctrine and concepts that gives you a capability. And those capabilities can be extended. I mean, the character of warfare does change periodically. How it is fought, nature of war, what it is, will never change. And I think we've got to be aware that we're at a cusp of one of those. This may be a genuine military revolution rather than revolution in military affairs. That's kind of a historian thing, but leave it at that. On the not learning, I would think the biggest thing is don't learn that you can ship stuff late. I mean, this whole uncontested logistics, it doesn't end at the border of Ukraine. They haven't even really struck deep into Ukraine. I'm puzzled about that, why they haven't hit those logistics facilities just over the border, but they haven't. And I think that may be the one that really worries me, the idea that you can wait and move heavy forces and make it work.
So to that point about being ready, and I think on the cyber side, I think we saw preparation. And so with regard to cyber warfare, we have not seen many outcomes to this point. And I don't think we should assume that, well, cyber warfare is no longer important or relevant. I think this is an issue of necessarily of preparation. The other piece, we talked about sort of the ascendancy of the defense, and we know historically that defense is the stronger form of war, but I think we can draw too much into that in saying that the offense is sort of dead or non-existent, because you cannot win without transition to the offense. So we have got to determine how do we employ close combat forces to decide the outcome. At the end of the day, you have to control the ground. I mean, that's what we measure today. Who owns the ground? And so this is going to require maneuver forces with capability. And so I think a lesson learned is that battalions, BTGs, or brigades can't do it themselves. So you have to elevate the echelon of warfare. So now, at least in my assessment, divisions and corps are fighting formations with capabilities that have to set those conditions for the brigades to be successful. And then this is my opportunity to address tanks. So I'm going to go ahead and say that you know, this is, I believe it's a misperception to believe that tanks are no longer relevant. We should not use poor Russian training, tactics, and tank design as our determinant with regard to manned combat platforms. The same can be said about manned rotary and fixed-wing aircraft. I think it's inconclusive to this point. We know, and it was sort of validated and proven. We can look back to the Yom Kippur War in '73, Arab-Israeli War, and we know that tanks fighting alone, unsupported against anti-tank guided missiles will fail. And I think we've seen that repeatedly in Ukraine to date.
All right, Gary.
Yeah, just to go back to the data theme again on the lessons that we shouldn't learn, you know, I would argue that this conflict is being conducted in a relatively homogeneous environment, right? And it's not as complex as the conflicts that we need to prepare for. And so the applications of AI/ML and the production of data that exist in this current conflict are not at the scale or level of complexity that we're going to have to do in order to conduct our operations in the future.
John.
I would just make one general comment and to provide a little bit of supporting fires to my Army colleague here. I mean, I'm an economist by training, right? So my sentences generally start out with on the one hand and on the other hand, which kind of tells you that yeah, I would not say that I don't think we're going to learn any binary lessons. So the general comment I would have would be, yes, if we think we're learning binary lessons, the tank is good, the tank is bad, out of this war, then we're drawing the wrong lessons. What we're going to learn is what are the vulnerabilities, what are the ways in which it was useful, and what were the vulnerabilities and ways in which it was not useful, and that will inform how we move forward. And I think that applies to all the things, to the use of drones, to the use of armor, to the use of cyber capabilities, which did not have the bark that we thought it was going to have initially. So I think my general comment would be binary lessons would be the wrong way to go. Sure. What we learn is what's working, what's not working, where to emphasize, where we need to invest more, what problems we need to overcome.
Okay. In terms of how the Ukrainians have essentially formed a joint all-domain command and control, if you will, in just a few months, as opposed to the U.S. military that continues to grapple with even explaining what it is at times. TX, you addressed this in your report. What do you think the U.S. can adopt from what the Ukrainians have learned and done here? And can we maybe give the U.S. a bit of credit in acknowledging that the scale is much greater, the missions are different, the goals are different, and there are just certain things that the U.S. has to work through policy-wise, technology sharing-wise, that's going to make this a slower process. Gary, well,
Sure, I'll
that's
start.
Good,
Yeah.
good place.
Again, homogeneous environment, right? It's one actor against another actor. In future conflicts, it'll be a large coalition that's probably going to flex over time. And so those sharing policies that are going to be required from a security and a policy perspective are going to be difficult. That's hard to build into the system. The current architectural construct that we have is made up of many enclaves, many of which still have man in the loop or person in the loop requirements. So it is more complex for us to try to get to where the Ukrainians have gotten to in their current situation. I think what we can learn, though, is that if we treat unclassified information, whether it's unclassified RF or OSINT or commercial geo radar, EO, whatever, as equal to classified information when we're building that environment, that puts us on a level playing field with most of the actors within a conflict. So the soldier on the ground, the airmen at the unit, they all work at pretty much the unclassified environment. And what we've seen is a level of autonomy of the soldiers in Ukraine who are able to act on that unclassified environment a lot faster, the unclassified information a lot faster. And I think if we were to take that as the baseline and then add the classified pieces on top of that, it might make things more effective for us.
Okay. Anyone else
I'm
want to
not
add to
enough
that?
of an expert on that to discuss it, but the thing I'm a victim of, Navy Marine Corps Internet and Defense Travel System. Both were designed by the people who are building JADC2. So I'm not as confident about this as others may be.
All right, we'll have to wait and see. John or Lee or Darren, anything to add?
I would say, that the fact that they've been able to come up with a JADC2-like capability is amazing. I'm a little suspect. I would love to see it because we have been promised JADC2-like capability in the past and have not, frankly, been able to achieve it. But I do think there are some lessons. And TX mentioned being able to use commercial satellite capability. The use of low Earth orbit satellite capabilities is huge. And then they have figured out how to use intermittent connectivity in their command and control systems. This is a problem for us where we constantly emit. I think fundamentally we're going to have to address this problem because it will impact our command post and leadership survivability going forward.
All right. Okay. So another interesting point
You
raised.
talked about industrial base in the long war. That's a critical point.
Right.
And one of the reasons we have to make this shift to new technology is we can't produce the old technology. 30 tanks a month in the only tank plant we own. Years to set up another one. 12 F-35s a month. 15 Air Forces sharing them. Just not your month. I don't care how many have been shot down. Not your turn, pal. So how do you do that? 5 years to build a frigate. We don't know how long to build a carrier because it doesn't work yet. If you accept that and accept you're going to go into a high attrition war with China, you've already accepted loss. And there's no way we're rebuilding that 20th century industrial base. We have to move to the 21st century. We have to look at it and say, okay, what's the opportunity cost? For the price of an F-35, I could have 1,000 Harrops on the opening day of a conflict with China. These are launched off the back of trucks scattered through the islands. Or one F-35 sitting on a base and you know exactly where it is. And by the way, there's a 50-50 chance it can't take off.
Okay. Well, so let's talk a little bit more about the industrial base then. Obviously we've got to do things to change our supply chain, make things go faster. TX, in your paper, you talked about how Russian planners assumed that this was going to be a short war, and they were wrong, and how Ukraine demonstrates the continued importance of a deep industrial base and the ability to sustain that. So what does this mean for current Pentagon planning with respect to Taiwan, for instance?
I'll start there. I mean, I think one point, right, is, my understanding, Chinese experts would have a more sophisticated understanding, but my understanding is that China wants to move as quick, if they move, they will move as quickly as possible, trying to make it a fait accompli. We have to be thinking about how do you defeat that. One is, well, we'll try to defeat that on politically unrealistic timelines by having forces there and doing things. That's one option. But the other option is how can we prevent that? How can we help Taiwan hold on until we can get into a situation, until we've had time to work with our Pacific allies, to work with our other allies, to work with the domestic political process, to really bring the U.S. into that engagement. We saw how long that took in Ukraine. a place where we'd had engagement, where we were on the ground already, and we saw how long it took, and we really didn't have the coalitions and the significant mobilizations until after the conflict started. So I think number one lesson is we have to be thinking much more than we currently are about how you help Taiwan hold on and not allow this to be a fait accompli.
If I could, I think the other aspect here is we have to address potential adversaries' deep magazines. So we cannot go round for round with our enemies. So we've got to think creatively and innovatively about how do we do this. So if they can put 1,000 drones in the air, what's the best way to deal with that? It's probably with our 1,000 of our own cheap drones. So what we may see is a reconnaissance, counter-reconnaissance fight now between drones, between robots in the air, robots on the ground, robots in the sea, where we're sort of trying to find their location and deny them ours. It's an advancement and evolution of the way that we currently fight. But we've got to come up with things like high-energy lasers, something that we can use where we don't have to have a large logistics base and a large supply base in order to address their capabilities.
Okay, Gary.
On the topic of pervasive surveillance, historically, we as a nation haven't had commensurate investment in the PED side of any ISR capability as opposed to the sensor and platform piece. And I think that's got to change if we're going to be successful going forward, if pervasive surveillance is a game-changing aspect of how we're going to conduct operations going into the future. And I would say even from an industrial-based perspective, not just—
the PED acronym for everybody?
I'm sorry, processing, exploitation, and dissemination. And that includes analysts, human beings who still have to look at these things. I think there's a shortcut mentality that says we have AI/ML and we'll be able to handle all this information through AI/ML, and that's just not true without the people there to train the algorithms, and that's always going to be required. And I think from a industrial-based perspective, not just producing hardware like tanks and equipment and drones, but we also have to produce data. Right, and you need the people and the capability to do that. And China has orders of magnitude more people producing data today than we do, and so they have the advantage right now.
And one thing on Taiwan I would consider, the Chinese have three things. They have the blockade campaign is the one that worries me most, because if they do a blockade campaign without actually striking at Taiwan, how do we break it? And the Taiwanese have not been serious about their own defense at all to date. They've got less than 30 days of oil, I think 12 days of natural gas. Nobody will tell me how much food they have. So we can't break that blockade in 30 days. Because again, you're trying to, all the ports are on the west coast with this short missile and even long-range artillery range of mainland China. And we are not good at hunting down mobile platforms. We've proven that repeatedly. So how do we sustain against a blockade? And I don't think we've done a serious enough study of that problem. We're focused on how do we stop the invasion, which I think is not that difficult because they're short of connectors. It's fine to have all the stuff on the big ships, but if you can't get to the beach, it doesn't matter. Again, if the Taiwanese will prepare their ports for destruction, which they've also refused to do. So different problem. And then you're in the long war. Then you're in, how do we sustain a 4 or 5 year war against China?
That'll be a difficult thing to solve. So I just want to backtrack a little bit, back to Ukraine here. And so another interesting point raised in the report is that the enemy is always going to be able to see us. We're always going to be able to see what they're doing. There's going to be constant contact with the enemy. That's not really something that we've experienced in the past through varying domains, if you will. So how do you envision militaries adapting to this new reality going forward?
There's
No,
two
I know.
ways you
Always
can adapt to that. You can get under overhead cover and go passive and don't reveal yourself till you shoot or resupply. Or you can play Where's Waldo. You play Where's Waldo, and we're seeing the Russians do this and the Chinese do this with containerized missiles. If you containerize everything, then if you're in the Philippines with the inside force, and maybe you've got 100 missile launchers in containers out of the 100,000 container trucks running around the Philippines, yeah, they'll know you're in a container, they just won't be able to do anything about it. The time on the Russian, from the time the lid comes up till 4 missiles are away is 10 minutes. So that's your warhead to forehead time. The bottom line is you're gonna have to start thinking about how do I look like everything around me? And how do I always make sure I've got overhead cover and I'm not emitting? I mean, the Marine Corps has been talking about that for about 10 years now. If you emit something, you're going to get killed. We just haven't figured out how to stop emitting.
I would say that the Russians are trying to cope with this problem in real time, and it's really throwing them for a loop. They believe very strongly in correlation of forces, and these are basic warfighting principles, amassing strike power and moving forward. And every time they do that, the surveillance picture is so complete that they are then targeted if they're within range. They have been, since the start of the conflict, trying to use these concealment techniques, and I've had some good luck to see some Maxar imagery. They're following the doctrine, they're hiding in the tree lines and everything else that they need to be doing, but just the resolution of what is possible from drones and possible from commercial imagery, it's defeating that. I mean, they have to go to pretty extreme lengths, and it's timely and it's costly. So I think we're going to be able to see what an adversary like this does when there's nowhere that they can safely congregate in depth. How do they move forward offensively? It's a really problem for them.
How do we do it?
Right, exactly. and how will we do it across the distances that we're talking about?
I think this does get at General Klingen's point about this is a much more complex and complicated fight to transition to the offense. We can't accept perfect battlefield awareness on either side. So we have to fight across multiple domains to deny them their ability to see us and engage us, even if it's temporarily, to move. Even if it's locally, to achieve a local objective and consolidate, and then potentially achieve a defense to consolidate your gains. But this is a higher level and more complex level, I think, of warfighting than we have seen to date, particularly in Ukraine, and you can see it with some of the struggles with the Russians.
Any other ideas or points to make on this one? All right, we'll move on to next. There's also a focus on precision fires and massing those types of weapons on the battlefield. So how are you seeing techniques change as these proliferate? For instance, I've seen video where Ukraine has used switchblade loitering munitions to take out individual soldiers in trenches, which is something that could not be done with such precision with traditional munitions or other weapons quite as well. So what are your thoughts on that?
I think fires is still the king of battle. Whether it's precision fires or non-precision fires, it is still in great use. Rockets, missiles, artillery rounds, mortars. Precision is always going to be in short supply. And so the question is, how do you apply the best weapon against the appropriate target? And I think this is where we're talking about using AI and machine learning to help us with intel. What we're starting to see in Ukraine is the next step of, okay, what are the prioritizations of targets? And then the next step is, what do I engage it with? And then I think the step after that is, how do I help it? How does AI help me determine decisions in terms of maneuver? But I do think, despite this fascination with precision munitions and drones, sort of drones gone wild, traditional fires are still going to have a role. You still have to be able to suppress. You still have to be able to deny areas, and you still have to be able to obscure the battlefield. And so dumb munitions are going to have a role to play, and every echelon is going to need them, whether it's the corps level deep fires to the division level deep fires fight to infantry squads needing mortars. You have to have fires at every echelon to enable your maneuver, and you have to have mobile capability as well in this battlefield to survive. So you'll be able to shoot and scoot.
But I think that's going to be the key problem. Mass fires rely on the ability to sustain it. I mean, the new Swedish piece, the Archer's great because it can roll into position, fire 3 rounds, and displace in 72 seconds. So that's survivable. Lone gun ops, so batteries in 6 different places firing. So you fire your 3 rounds, and now you got to run. And so you got to run for 10 or 15 minutes. So that's not sustained suppression. The other problem you got is if I have orbiting munitions overhead, your ability to move goes really low. So I think we've got to get away from platforms and focus on weapons. And when platforms with their armor or their artillery, whatever they are going to be vulnerable. And there's a transition period. This will be a transition period just like we used some of the materials. The transition to direct fire accuracy goes from 1863 to 1917 before somebody really figures it out. So you've got that, and we've got to start thinking that through, because I think while we say, yes, I want mass munitions, that's one of the curious things about Ukraine, I've seen almost no use of smoke and very few shots of VT. And yet VT against these crawling infantry would be much better. Instead, they're using unitary warheads. I don't know why.
Yeah.
But that whole process changes as the other side begins to get munitions that loiter at the range of yours. So range is going to be critical. This is another place defense has a huge advantage. As General mentioned, range gives you the ability to disperse your firing batteries, but the nature of ground combat is you have to come through congested areas, whether they're cities or passes. The same with sea. You've got to come through straits. You've got to come through channels. If I have Tomahawk cruise missiles, I can have my missiles anywhere in Luzon and dominate the Bastia Channel. How do you hunt all of Luzon to find my missiles? I know when you're in that strait, because that's pretty easy. And you'll know where I am when the missiles start coming. But it doesn't matter because you're shooting an empty box. That's the transition we've got to make.
Just to beat the data horse one more time, I think continued investment in the nation's PNT capability is critical as well. It needs significant upgrading, and I know there have been a lot of efforts made to do that, but we need to continue to invest in that, as well as commercially available precision 3D data that, again, is shareable globally and usable at every echelon within the battle space and provides us an advantage. That also keeps us more efficient and effective with the munitions we are using and limits the impact on the industrial base.
PNT is critical because our industrial base goes away if there's not PNT because nobody can get to work.
Right.
You can't get gas out of the gas station.
Right.
Okay. I want to talk about logistics. So, I think lots of people like to say that we're learning things from logistics by watching Russian failure in certain ways, or, certainly there's been other challenges on the Ukrainian side to learn from in terms of logistics. But describe what's been observed and how military should adapt and think about logistics going forward in more contested environments. And also, what are the Russians doing right? We talk a lot about what they're not doing, but they're still fighting, so they've got to be doing something right. So let's focus on that a little bit too. Dara, I'll let you take that.
I'll jump in. Yes, and I'm not a logistician, but it's the debates have been really interesting to me to watch play out, because on one hand you have this conversation of, wow, Russian logistics is broken, they stress themselves, they plan this poorly, their logistics is failing. And in the exact same time, you'll have conversations of, oh, I can't believe how many tens of thousands of rounds of artillery that they're firing on a daily basis. Like, that doesn't happen without logistics. Their logistics is working hard. I don't think it's working efficiently. I think that's the key distinction here, but they are throwing a lot of lead at this problem, and they're able to do so. Not with rail anymore. TX's paper is excellent. You should read it. It's awesome. But this is a point that you make. I mean, they are less efficient now because of the rail, because of the HIMARS strikes, but they're still going after it. Really, though, if we go back to where it all went wrong for the Russians, it was from the beginning. It was too many lines of attack. The logistics was attacked relentlessly by the Ukrainians because they were vulnerable, because they didn't have enough screening support to even support their advancing columns, let alone the logistics, let alone the food. It just really went off the rails. But that being said, they're still going. And I don't think we should count them out. It's just not the way that we would do it.
Sure. I'd like to take this. Lee?
I was going to say, I think we're going to see a very interesting event here as the Ukrainians transition to the offense, and see how well are they able to sustain their forces in the attack. So they have capability, but can they provide the endurance before they culminate, which is essentially what we saw with the Russians. They culminated through logistics. And the Ukrainians have shown some great success attacking logistics. It's interesting, I think, that the Russians have chosen instead to attack infrastructure with their deep fires and try to demoralize the population, which has not really had much success to date.
For the Russians, part of the problem is they're attacking infrastructure because it's a fixed target. I know where it is.
Very
where the
easy.
logistics people move around, and they don't have the kind of pervasive surveillance from your satellites that we have. I would say that's going to be interesting, but largely irrelevant to future conflict, what they can do, because again, these are 90% 20th century armies fighting each other. Can they move it? The general mentioned you can't get class 5 and class 9 ammunition and parts. But on the other hand, you can get a lot of the rest of it. For the inside force, if it's light and small, you put 50,000 Marines ashore in the Philippines, there's 105 million Filipinos. They can feed you, they can water you. Don't bring your own trucks, bring credit cards,
Uber.
money, and gold. I mean, when I was seconded to the CIA, and our E&E plan in Africa was everybody had a belt full of gold. That was it. There weren't helicopters, there weren't LHAs offshore. I mean, if DOD would have been doing this, it would have taken 2 years to put it together and several $1 billion. And he just came out with gold sewed into belts. Apparently had it in a warehouse somewhere. That sort of concept, live off the land as much as you can, even some of your medical supplies, but all your motor T and parts for motor T. Then you have to move in ammunition, your specific data requirements for processing data, and parts. And 3D printing will solve a lot of your parts problem. But only if we change our concept of what an industrial base looks like and what we produce.
I have a logistics conundrum.
Don't we all?
So, if we're talking about the inability to mass in one place at one time because of persistent surveillance, then that means that you have to disperse, you have to federate. What does that do for your logistical burden? How will you handle it? And this is a problem that we have to grapple with.
Well, the Marine Corps is actually experimenting with that. And with these small units out there, there's some experiments with unmanned vessels so that you land your big stuff in Australia, you put it coming up the inner island chain on coastal steamers, and an unmanned for the last, like unmanned aircraft. As we move to the drone industry, is tremendous what they're doing. I mean, the drone industry wants, for home delivery, vertical takeoff and landing, 1 meter accuracy. It's got to be radar hardened. It's got to be GPS independent, flying the urban canyons. It's got to be cheap, because in the South, aerial delivery is skeet shooting with prizes. And you've got to have increasing payload and range. Well, that's what we want. So the industry is going to build this stuff for us, and already are. I mean, the Marine Corps is testing a bunch of stuff. But we're getting out to hundreds of miles with hundreds of pounds. If you're a small unit out there and they're resupplying from southern Luzon out of the range of the Chinese forces, then you can sustain forces forward. But you got to completely change your thought process.
Absolutely.
You can't go big.
Okay. Just wanted to remind the audience that if you have a question, there is an iPad going around. You can type in your question, just raise your hand and let them know, and they'll give you an iPad. And then if you are viewing via Zoom, just hit the Q&A tab to ask a question. And if you are tweeting your question, use the hashtag #ForwardDefense. I'm going to give you all a little bit more of a chance to ask questions that way. Ask one more question, and then I'll turn to questions from the audience. So opening up the aperture, is the war in Ukraine providing lessons learned about the requirement for and role of ground combat and how DoD interprets and implements the National Defense Strategy? And to sort of home in on that a little bit more, Pentagon planners and budgeteers are assuming that all domain conflict is becoming less likely and that forces in the naval and air domains are going to dominate the next war. Does the occurrence of major ground war challenge these assumptions? And John, I'll let you go first on this one.
Well, I certainly think it raises questions that the Pentagon should be focused on, right? I mean, I would echo what you just said. I mean, the dominant view among many is that the next war is likely to be a very fast standoff missile exchange over the Taiwan Strait and the Chinese mainland, primarily in the naval and air domains. That's largely what the budgets are building towards that DoD submitted the last few years. That's what a lot of the conversations about within the Pentagon about how to prepare and what capabilities to invest in and where to allocate the resources. So I certainly think that is a dominant view out there, and I certainly think that the fact that the next war turned out to be a protracted land war in Europe does raise questions about that. The challenge is, what are the answers, right? The answers are probably, what happens in the Pacific won't look exactly like what's happening in Ukraine, but it probably also won't exactly look like what's being modeled in the Pentagon right now. So it's somewhere in between those two extremes, and trying to figure out how to be as robust as possible. And the TX's point, I mean, it's not necessarily just an amphibious landing on Taiwan. It's the South China Sea. It's a blockade. It's North Korea. It's there's a lot of things in the Pacific that could go wrong. So so I certainly think that the idea of a protracted ground war, when the thinking was that the next war would not be that, should raise questions. I certainly think a point I made earlier, the fact that we had what we thought was very exquisite intelligence saying that this was for real, and that we really could not get significant agreement among allies, so we really could not get domestic support for significant deployment and mobilization of forces until after hostilities had started. That's another thing that kind of contradicts where the Pentagon's at right now, that they're going to move very early, very fast on early intelligence and warning. So I think that's certainly a lesson learned that applies to the Pacific. And then I think another thing that we've already talked about here, how do you get, if it's an ally or protecting a friend's territorial integrity, how do you get them to hang on until we can get there, until we can build the support to get there, until we can overcome the logistical challenges of getting there? We should be thinking about, what's the Taiwanese equivalent of the 2014 to 2022 training. We should be thinking about how do you build the resilience in Taiwan that we've seen in Ukraine and that TX said just a few minutes ago that we're not seeing yet. So I think all those are lessons learned.
Absolutely. Anyone else want to pile on that before we go to questions?
Yeah, I would be cautious about that. You've got to prioritize in spending. That's what a strategy is. And the Pacific theater is clearly the more important one. And it's going to be an air and sea battle because it's got to be resolved before the ground forces can get there. We've got to break the back of the PLAN and the PLAF and the rocket force too before we begin to put forces there. I don't see him introducing ground forces into Taiwan as being anything other than presenting China with hostages. Wars between major powers for the last 250 years have lasted years to decades. So this short war, you're absolutely right, that's a delusion. So you got to figure out how am I going to fight a long war and what makes it win. And I think it's exhaustion. Historically, it's been exhaustion of one of the powers and very often economic exhaustion. And you do that because you can cut China off from the sea and the overland routes are not an alternative. They simply can't move the material. So a long war based on a distant blockade gives you an option. And the Army's multi-domain task forces are moving that direction and will provide enormous capability when we get them developed.
I think there is a ground role for this, but not necessarily the decisive role initially. It's the positioning of capabilities from islands to be able to influence the maritime and the air domain.
Yeah, but that's
right?
the missile and air war, the missile and drone.
Absolutely.
Just very quickly, I think it's not just the Pentagon that has to be thinking through this, right? It's the national security enterprise writ large and the industrial base. And don't forget all of our partners who are out there and have a very different perspective than we do. And oftentimes their perspective can be more right than ours.
Absolutely. Okay. We're going to turn to questions from the audience. The first is from Sam Skov, Defense One. Russian GPS jamming has been an issue for Ukraine across the front line. How well prepared is the U.S. military for GPS jamming? What about electronic warfare in general?
I'll take that one.
Do you want to jump on that, Gary?
Yeah, so, with the environment we're in, I'm limited in how to answer that question, but I would just say that what I said earlier, right, continued investment is required.
And I think from the Army's perspective, what I've seen is a significant effort to make sure that we have assured position, navigation, and timing.
Right.
But interesting, commercial firms are working on GPS independent navigation for their drones. And it's aboard the drone, so there's no way to jam it.
Super important, absolutely. All right, next question is from Albert Goldson, Executive Director of Cerulean Council. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. How will the United States maintain an ongoing manufacture, upgrade, and training of multi-generational surveillance and kinetic technology that have been used quite effectively by Ukraine's army?
I'm not sure exactly what he's asking. Multi-generational, non-specific.
All right, well, we'll skip that.
What we're trying to do is
a
replace
little
it
bit
as
more.
fast as we can.
Right, exactly. Right. We'll pass on by, and if he is in the audience, perhaps you can talk to him a little bit offline about this. Next question, Benjamin Deinkin. One of the interesting elements of the conflict has been combat in the information environment, particularly leveraging the use of social media platforms. How do you think the rise of AI-generated deep fakes and synthetic media will impact future conflicts? That's a great question. Who wants to jump into that one first? Darryl.
Oh, gosh. We're not ready. We're not ready for deep fakes. There's a lot of really upsetting, traumatic content out there floating around on Twitter or Telegram wartime footage. And it's difficult for most people to look at and sit there and study and try to figure out, is this a deep fake or not? Most people just see it and try to move away from it as quickly as possible. I have not seen a large-scale injection of deepfakes. There have been some from time to time since this war, but it hasn't really been a phenomenon. And I really think we need to think about that moving forward. What would we do if there were deepfakes of American service personnel doing horrible things? Well, you know, how would we debunk that? How would we have the technology to do that? What is the messaging in advance? I mean, this is coming. I'm surprised that it's not in this war.
Yeah.
But I think it's probably a technical limitation, maybe.
They've
but
tried. They've tried staging some things that very quickly the internet picks up what's wrong with it. They'll pick up, okay, this guy's tennis shoes are wrong or this patch is wrong.
Right.
So that's good. I think the Ukrainians have provided a master class in information warfare, how to get the allies on side, and the Russians a master class on how to control your own information and how to keep the global south on side. Because that's what's been fascinating to me. The global south sided with Russia. I mean, Russia is leading the UN Security Council this month, for Christ's sake.
Right. Okay. Bob Barnes asks, there are two purposes for a military force, deterrence of war and victory in war. We have always treated those two forces as largely the same. Is that still a valid concept, or do we need to have a duality of force structure? Who would like to tackle that one first? TX, John?
I would say it's not a duality. Deterrence will give you victory, but you're not looking for victory. If you're fighting a thermonuclear armed enemy, what you're looking is for resolution on favorable basis. You don't want to overthrow the other guy if he's got thermonuclear weapons. So we've got to get over this concept of a theory of victory. We want a theory of conflict resolution well short of nuclear war.
Let's see, Mike DeRosa, what parallels can be drawn between our industrial capacity now versus how it was before World War II? Tex, you might have done some research on this, but if anyone would like to answer that, feel free.
We have an opportunity to get there if we invest in advanced manufacturing. There's clusters of advanced manufacturing around the country. The problem is we're tied up with the old system. We're spending billions of dollars on the F-35, and now we discover the engine doesn't work. We're building carriers, which everybody knows are targetable. We've got a few tanks, but not many. So if you move to advanced manufacturing, I would suggest doing something like we did to craft the Civil Reserve Air Fleet. We buy a piece of every airplane, and when war comes, we mobilize it. Why don't we buy a piece of advanced manufacturing factories? We finance 20% of your factory. When war starts, we come in with our designs, and you have to print what we want. That would allow us to both move into advanced manufacturing, which is where we need to be, frankly, reduce the supply chain. The turboprop in Europe, the Denali turboprop, went from 855 parts to 10 for a turboprop engine. That kind of solves your parts chain problem. So that's where we need to be investing. We're not in that shape now. We have not got the investment there, but we've got to start pumping money into advanced manufacturing.
There was an interesting article out today too about international partnerships on production for the industrial base that I think was really telling as well. We're not going to be able to solve this by ourselves, and so how do we work with our partners similar to what we're doing with AUKUS to get to where we need to be as a collective to be prepared?
Sure. Any other points? Okay. Armed helicopters do not seem to be prominent in the war in Ukraine. Is that aspect of what is referred to as air-land battle a thing of the past? John, you look like you have an answer, and then we'll go to Lee.
We have somebody
You
who knows. I would just come in with the general comment and then defer to somebody who actually knows what he's talking about to give a more detailed answer. But we're not going to learn binary lessons from Ukraine. We're going to learn what worked. We're going to learn where we need to invest and where we need to harden and where we need to overcome challenges. We're not going to learn a yes or no answer on aircraft, on defense versus offense, on tanks, et cetera.
Yeah, so as a division commander in Afghanistan, employing helicopters is a very complex, complicated event. And as we train divisions to employ their aviation brigades today, in a modern scenario or a scenario 10 years from now, it's even more complicated. And so I don't know that we can draw those conclusions given what we've seen so far in Ukraine. But I do think there's still great value in manned armed helicopters. Some of what we see and what we're trying to progress is this idea of manned and unmanned teaming. And so they are paired with drones so that are ahead of the manned aircraft. We are using long-range capabilities for the helicopters so they can have a much greater standoff and they're less vulnerable. They can use terrain to their defense. They've got countermeasures, extensive countermeasures. We're using all domain fires, lethal and non-lethal, et cetera, to create the right conditions for their successful employment.
This gets to opportunity cost. You have to do all those things to fly a helicopter or to fly a manned aircraft off a runway. I can put up a $20,000 drone with a motorcycle engine and fly it 1,000 miles, fly outrange your aircraft. Sure, you can knock them down, they're easy, but how much do you have to invest to protect every airfield and every landing place, as opposed to how much I have to invest? And then again, as you begin to produce these, the cost comes down. The professor 3D printed a drone about this big in 28 hours in 2014. Printing's at least 100 times faster. That's where I get to the number you can do 10,000 to 100,000 in a factory. If there's that and they're in containers, then I'm not sure how you defend your airbase against that. So this is why the focus on weapons, not platforms. We've been platform focused since World War I.
Yeah. But to that point, though, I mean, for every action, there is the counteraction, right? And so you have to fight from unimproved airfields. You have to have air and missile defense. You have to have active countermeasures. You have to have passive countermeasures. So, there, for every, this is the, for every advantage, there's a counter to it that we have to address.
At what point does it become so expensive that the opportunity cost to pay for all that stuff to get a squadron of armed helicopters, would I be better off with 30,000 cheap drones in containers? That's there'll be a transition period as we work through this, and we're working through this in all the services now, but we've got to start doing that. I mean, the Air Force is looking at loyal wingmen. Well, the NGAD, the last cost estimate was 5 times out of an F-35. Oh, $600 million buys you one fighter, which can be killed on the runway. Because it's really stealthy in the air, but it spends 95% of itself parked where I can see it. So how many air defense batteries do I need to protect that airfield from all the different kinds of threats? And do I end up with a $1 billion fighter? And is that worth it?
I mean, you also have to defend the drone factory, right? You have to.
But that's in the U.S. And also, if you're 3D printing drones, they can be really scattered. A drone factory can be in any container anywhere in the country. So yeah, you can find it maybe, but if I've parked it in a bus garage under overhead cover, you're going to be really hard pressed to find it other than local intelligence. And that's what we've got to experiment. We've got to start playing these things off against each other, but we've got to start doing opportunity costs. What could I buy instead of that?
Well, I love that debate, but I'm afraid we're almost out of time. So I do want to let you each deliver a few closing remarks. Anything you didn't get a chance to say, we'll start and we'll go straight down the line, and then we should be ending very shortly. So Lee, I'll have you start here.
I think it's time for another STARRY study. It's time to take a very deliberate and active look at what's happening in Ukraine and come up with some actionable decisions on how to move forward. I also think, we're trying to solve problems. There's great capabilities in the commercial world. We've got to bring our commercial partners under the tent and help us solve problems more directly. To this point about manufacturing and how do we rapidly mobilize and manufacture, I think there's a question as to what. And so constant modernization, maybe in small scale, so that we're experimenting, we're putting things in the hands of our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, so that when we do have to go, we can rapidly generate that capability and get it out to the force. So we may need a rapid equipping force-like capability again, generated within our departments, so that we can get this capability out. And we're constantly modernizing on a small scale. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Lee. John.
I'd just like to thank, the Atlantic Council, Steve Grundman, TX, very helpful paper, very insightful paper. So thank you for what you've done. I'll just repeat again, I don't think we're going to learn binary lessons. So I think we need to be looking at what we are learning, how we're going to apply what we're learning, and how, and then, some of the things that we've talked about here, are the assumptions we're making in the Pacific consistent with how things played out in Ukraine. I think that'd be a very valuable exercise.
I also wanted to thank the Atlantic Council for inviting me, and TX, I think your paper is excellent. It is succinct It's digestible, and you're getting a lot of complex things in a very short amount of space, and that's very difficult to do. Highly recommend you all reading this paper. And just to reiterate, this war is not over. Russia is gearing up to make this a very protracted war. Are we ready? Do we know? There's no easy choices left for what that means. In terms of drawing lessons, one thing I would caution, there is a bit of a debate out there of we should close the chapter on this and we need to focus exclusively on the Indo-Pacific. And I would argue that what we're doing now and the innovation that we're being exposed to, how we're seeing the Russians perform, how the Ukrainians perform, and how we're supporting some of those efforts, we're learning too, and we're getting stronger and we're innovating. So this is not a zero-sum trade. It's a complementary sort of learning experience. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Steve and the Atlantic Council team for putting this together, and other panelists for the comments you sent me when I was writing the paper were very, very useful. And other than that, I think I've said more than enough.
Carrie,
I'll just say thank you as well to everybody. I know we're short on time, and just say we talked here a little bit about how expensive all of this is and how costly this is from a resource, human, and dollar perspective, and that we won't know what's next, right? There's no binary lessons we're going to learn. So what I would say is we need to be efficient and let industry do what industry does best and let government do what government does best.
well, thank you all for a very interesting and insightful conversation today.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jen Judson, and to the entire panel, General Mark Klingon, and again, not least to TX Hammes, who has written this terrific paper here, which those of you in the room can get a paper copy of. Those of you online or watching can get off of the Atlantic Council's website. It's available beginning this afternoon. I'm going to paraphrase to illustrate how exemplary I think this event was of what the mission of, as it's called, the forward defense practice of the Scowcroft Center is. To paraphrase, we have helped here shape the debate around the greatest defense challenges facing the United States and its allies, and created forward-looking assessments of the trends, technologies, and concepts that will define the future of warfare. That's the mission statement of the forward defense practice of the Atlantic Council, and I think the paper and this discussion well exemplifies that mission. Thanks again to everyone, not least to those of you who are here in the room and were watching. Come back to another Atlantic Council event, and we'll do something like this on another topic again soon. Thank you.